Okay, and the recording has started. So let me just start the presentation. And just a reminder, these are, this is a really casual way for, it's just a casual webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me and just, shout out any questions you may have. But there'll also be time at the end to ask questions as well. So this month's, sorry, Sean, did you have a question?
What are earmarks?
Sure. So to get right into it, we're going to talk about earmarks. And so to give a definition on earmarks, as you can see in this slide, earmarks don't necessarily have one definition. So you may have heard of earmarks in the news, but I kind of feel like it's a term that people don't really know the exact definition of. And people know that earmarks relate to funding, but the exact definition, or typically, earmarks refer to a legislator who is seeking to insert an earmark or funding that direct a specified amount of money to a particular organization or project in their home state or district. So for many years, earmarking was a principal aspect of legislative policymaking. So as you going through the definitions on this slide, there are earmarks that are referred to as hard marks or hard earmarks, and they're written directly into legislation and thus explicitly laying out by law. Thus, they're explicitly laid out and they're legally binding. So, that funding that someone has specifically laid out for a specific project or organization is legally binding within the law. And then there are soft marks, which are found in the text of congressional committee reports. And they're not technically legally binding, but for the most part, they're treated the same as hard marks. And then the Merriam-Webster definition says that earmarks are legislation that allocates, again, a specified amount of money for a specific project, program, or organization. The House and Senate define earmarks as provisions that are Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry. I just realized I was muted, and I really apologize. I don't know how I got muted. My apologies. So I'm going to start from the beginning, but I sincerely apologize for any confusion. Anyway, thank you for letting me know. Yikes. Okay, so we're going to start from the beginning. Again, my sincere apologies. So we're going to start. Sean asked a question. Obviously, this presentation is about earmarks and public spending. And again, earmarks are related to federal funding and used to be used quite a lot within the past 20 years. So we're just going to go over what earmarks are. So again, as shown on this slide, earmarks do not have one definition. So typically, a legislator seeks to insert earmarks or specifically federal funding that direct a specified amount of money to a particular organization or project in their home state or district. So for many years, earmarking was a principal aspect of legislative policy making. Hard earmarks or hard marks, which are on the slide, which talk about a specific kind of earmark, are written directly into legislation, thus explicitly laid out by law and are legally binding. Soft earmarks or soft marks are found in the text of congressional committee reports, and they're not technically legally binding, but are treated similarly to hard earmarks. Then, specifically, the Merriam-Webster definition says that earmarks are legislation that allocates a specified amount of money for a specific project, program, or organization. The House and Senate have a little bit of a different definition. They say that Earmarks are provisions that are tailored to specific programs or locations outside the formula-driven or competitive award process. And then the White House Office of Management and Budget, that's the White House OMB, they have what I think is a really interesting definition of earmarks. They say that earmarks are provisions that curtail the ability of the executive branch to manage its statutory and constitutional responsibilities pertaining to the fund's allocation process. So I think that definition is really interesting because I think it gives a little bit more of a negative definition of earmarks. And we're actually going to talk about the earmarks and how it relates to the powers of the executive branch and the legislature branch later in this presentation. But that definition is very indicative of how earmarks relates to power between the two branches. So just want to go over a quick history of earmarks. Senator Harry Reid, who was depending on which party was in control in Congress at the time, was Senate Majority Leader or Senate Minority Leader, recently retired, a Democrat from Nevada. And he once stated that earmarks have been used for 200 years. So he would be correct. The first instance of Congress using earmarks, or the practice that we now refer to as earmarking, was in the Lighthouse Act of 1789. And this measure, which was passed by the very first Congress of the United States, allocated federal funds for the construction of lighthouses in states along the Atlantic coast. So the earmarking in this act was drawn up by the congressional delegation from Pennsylvania, which, along with the help of an interest group, pushed to include federal funding for a pier in Philadelphia, according to a 1991 report from the Senate Historical Office. So that's kind of interesting. So this is considered the first time an earmark has been used, and also considered the first time that an interest group influenced public policy. Excuse me. Another instance is when South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun used what amounts to an earmark in the bonus bill of 1817, which would have allocated money to be used for public works projects in the states. However, up until about, which we'll go over, about until 20 years ago, earmarks were not necessarily used extensively during this time. So, going further in history, around the 19th century, politicians began referring to the practice as pork barrel politics.
What does pork barrel politics mean?
Sure. So pork barrel is a metaphor for the appropriation of government spending for localized projects secured solely or primarily to bring money to a representative's district. So it's a little bit different from earmarking, and definitely has an even more negative connotation, because in election campaigns the term is used in a derogatory fashion to attack opponents. So essentially it means that members of Congress would use earmarks, often a little more inappropriately, for projects that would solely benefit their constituents and in return would receive votes or campaign help. So typically pork involves funding for government programs whose economic or service benefits are concentrated in a particular area, but whose costs are spread among all taxpayers. So public works projects, certain national defense spending projects, and agricultural subsidies are the most commonly cited examples. So an interest group called the Citizens Against Government Waste outlines 7 criteria by which spending can be classified as pork, and those include that the spending was requested by only one chamber of Congress, that the spending was not specifically authorized. So as I've noted in past webinars about the budget, discretionary funding has to be authorized. So as an example, today the House passed the National Defense Authorization Act because the Department of Defense actually falls under discretionary funding. So the Department of Defense has to be authorized to spend the government's money, and then it's appropriated money. So if something is not specifically authorized, it can be classified as pork. Some other criteria include that the pork wasn't competitively awarded, it wasn't requested by the president, it greatly exceeds the president's budget request or the previous year's funding, and it's not the subject to congressional hearings, and it serves only a local or special interest.
Can you provide an example of pork barrel spending?
Sure. So one of the most famous alleged pork barrel projects was the Big Dig in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, but the Big Dig was a project to relocate an existing 3.5-mile section of the interstate highway system underground. And the official planning phase started in 1982, and that construction work was done between 1991 and 2006, and then the project concluded in 2007. It ended up costing the United States $14.6 billion and over $4 billion per mile. So Tip O'Neill, who's a Democrat from Massachusetts, after whom one of the Big Dig tunnels was named, basically pushed to have the Big Dig funded by the federal government while he was Speaker of the United States of the House of Representatives. So a lot of people use that example as an example of pork barrel politics, but we're kind of going to get into why earmarks are a little bit different and why earmarks can actually be beneficial. But first, just again, want to go over current history of earmarks. So as I mentioned before, earmark spending surged over the past 20 years. So as you can see on the graph, between 1994 and 2005, excuse me, total spending from earmarks more than doubled, rising from $218 million to $500 million, according to the Congressional Research Service, which is a nonpartisan research, the nonpartisan research arm of Congress. And then over the same time period, earmark spending as a percentage of total appropriations rose from 1.3% to 3%. So as you can see, that obviously shows that earmarking was more popular. But as you can see on the graph in the dip right here, earmark spending declined in 2007 when President Bush urged Congress to curtail their use of earmarks in his State of the Union address. And that was followed subsequently with some legislation that regulated earmarks, and then President Bush actually, I believe, had an executive order that also curtailed the use of earmarks.
I see on the graph that there's very limited use over the last few years. Do you still use earmarks?
Yeah, so that goes into the most recent history, and to answer your question, no, we do not use earmarks anymore in their traditional sense because they were banned in 2010. Excuse me. When Republicans won the House in 2010, their first act in power was to ban earmarks because they had become, with the public, synonymous with a couple of high-profile corrupt pork barrel spending cases, which is, again, different from earmarking. However, the earmark ban was a bipartisan effort. It wasn't just an effort from Republicans, with Democrats supporting the earmark ban as well, and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi also supporting the earmark ban. So this kind of was because of earmarks kind of had a bad PR time. Earmarks became a really bad word in Washington, and they were very unpopular with the public, so Congress felt compelled to act, even if only a few cases of earmarking were actually corrupt.
Why were earmarks unpopular with the public?
Sure. So a lot of blame can be placed on the Gravina Island Bridge, which is commonly, I'm sure you're also familiar with this bridge to nowhere if you lived through the 2008 presidential election. And the bridge to nowhere was a proposed bridge to replace the ferry that currently connects the town of Ketchikan, Alaska, with Gravina Island, which is an island that contains the Ketchikan International Airport as well as 50 residents. That bridge was projected to cost $398 million, and members of the Alaskan congressional delegation were the bridge's biggest advocates in Congress and helped push for federal funding. So a lot of people, said that, why are we building an expensive bridge for an island that only has 50 people when there's already a ferry? And it obviously encountered fierce opposition outside of Alaska as a symbol of pork barrel spending. And again, is labeled as the bridge to nowhere. So as a result, Congress removed the federal earmark for the bridge in 2005. And another, interesting note is that this is when the government was also spending, rightly so, a lot of money on Hurricane Katrina. So it just garnered extra criticism.
Are there any other examples of corrupt earmarks?
There are definitely other examples. So in 2006, I think that this is a really funny one. $500,000 was appropriated for the construction of the Sparta Teapot Museum in Sparta, North Carolina. And, I think that everyone can just kind of analyze that for themselves and decide if that is really necessary. And then Congressman Duke Cunningham was actually sentenced in 2006 to 8 years and 4 months in prison for pleading guilty for accepting $2.4 million in bribes, because Congressman Cunningham was basically accepting kickbacks from military contractors for steering business their way, because he was a member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee and the Intelligence Committee, and he was basically inserting pork barrel spending and earmarks into military spending and accepting bribes, which is obviously illegal. However, I mean, these are obviously really egregious examples of how, if used inappropriately and if people take advantage of earmarks, that they can become very corrupt and obviously really, not beneficial at all, because it's taking money away from projects that could actually help people. But it should also be noted that earmarks never accounted for a meaningful portion of federal spending. In 2015, non-discretionary funding accounted for, which includes, Social Security, Medicare, accounted for almost 2/3 of the annual budget, while compared to earmark spending only accounted for 1% of the budget in 2015. So, it just shows that earmarking wasn't used as extensively as that I think a lot of people tend to believe. So some would argue that earmarks became unpopular due to these very public but few corruption scandals, as opposed to legitimate complaints that earmarks are bad for government. And actually, if you Google earmarks now, as I did while I was researching for this presentation, you'll find a lot of articles that argue that earmarks were actually really good for the government and actually helped legislators to work together, of course, when they are used responsibly and they're not corrupt.
That's really interesting. Can you tell me more about that? Is there any chance that earmarks...
Sorry, we're having a hard time hearing the questions.
Yeah.
I hear loud and clear. But
no worries. Sean, if you could just speak into the speaker, that'd be great.
Is there any chance that earmarks could come back?
Sure. So I'm going to show a little more evidence that earmarks, may be actually good for the government. So, and, in terms of bringing back earmarks, today many lawmakers avoid using the word at all costs. And while they're still trying to, but basically they're still trying to insert targeted spending provisions into bills. So, again, like I said before, earmarks are banned, but today we still use provisions that are used for targeted spending. They're just called by other names. They're called member-directed spending, plus-ups, budget enhancements, additions, and programmatic adjustments. So lawmakers can basically call agency officials and directly and ask them, in the absence of any legislation, to put money toward specific projects. So this practice is known as phone marking. And so because of this, earmarks technically still kind of exist. They're just used in a different way and don't necessarily help with legislatures cooperating with each other, because they can't be used as leverage. So as I said before, earmarks can be used as an incentive to cooperate, and we all know that Congress needs as much help as possible when it comes to cooperating. So there is currently a push to bring back congressionally directed spending, potentially with reforms, because as I mentioned before, there were really egregious examples of how earmarks were being used inappropriately. So if they brought them back with reforms to make sure that that didn't happen in the future, it could actually be a good tool. A lot of people claim that the ban contributed to gridlock in Washington, basically by robbing party leaders of their ability to sweeten legislation for reluctant members. Because in the past, members could offer earmarks to round up votes, but now they're more empty-handed. So moderate lawmakers in particular are left with little leverage to prevent gridlock when their more ideologically extreme colleagues are unwilling to cooperate. So, that's one example. Another reason bringing back earmarks might be good is because they actually allow elected officials to allocate money instead of unelected bureaucrats. That's one argument that I read a lot about. So the elimination of earmarks actually contributed to the devolution of power from Congress to the executive branch, which is something that I mentioned earlier. So the ban has become a source of particular frustration for people in Congress who have long railed against, both people in Congress who kind of, rail against the president's increasing use of executive actions, both Democrat and Republican presidents, to carry out policies that the legislature is declined to approve. Even so, with the earmark process, decisions are now made without the knowledge of the outside world and without any recourse to rein in waste, fraud, and abuse. So with earmarks, we had complete transparency. We knew who proposed the earmark, what it was for, how much it was for, and we gave members a chance to vote on it, to actually put their name on the record, for an earmark. Often the most controversial earmarks were subject to standalone votes in the chamber, so voters could clearly see how their members voted. And now this is the complete opposite of how spending is occurring under the earmark ban.
Wow, those are interesting points. Can you show me more evidence that earmarks affects the way Congress works together?
Sure. So I'm going to quickly go over these next slides. And this just kind of shows you more data as to how, earmarking is one reason why the ban on earmarks is one reason why Congress is having a tough time working together. So as you can see on this slide, there's a huge ideological gap in Washington, and there are no moderates. I think we can safely say there are almost no moderates, very few. You can probably count them on your hand how many moderates there are in Congress. So this just means that congressional members are less likely to cooperate with each other, and it makes it increasingly difficult to pass laws, which is shown in my next two slides. So this is Congress's productivity in the past 40 years. As you can see, 15 years ago, it used to be that Congress could pass on this very first bar. Congress used to pass about 750 bills in a year. And now, looking at this past Congress, the 114th Congress, they enacted 329 laws. So, I mean, that's less than half of, or a little less than half of what they could enact almost 15 years ago. And then the 112th Congress is when Congress instituted the ban on earmarks, and that was their least productive Congress on record. So that's just, it just kind of shows that, again, the ban on earmarks aren't the sole reason why Congress is unproductive, but it definitely just, it doesn't help, basically. It just doesn't help. As you can see, Congress is more productive with earmarks than without, and again, as I said, less laws have been enacted. There are limited, number of carrots available to congressional leaders tasked with one of the toughest jobs in Washington, which is making laws. That's why they call it making sausage. The vast majority of bills, as many of you know, never make it to the drafting stage. And, now we have, they need majority support in the House, and then in the Senate, they need to be filibuster proof because the Senate has come to use the filibuster a lot. And even if they can get all that, they still might die in the conference part where the House and Senate have both passed a bill, and then both chambers need to agree on a conference version. So it's a really tough process. And earmarks were really helpful because they were able to lay them on the table every time major legislation came to the floor. So the implicit agreement was that if you vote for a bill that spends billions of dollars on national priorities, you'll be able to brag about the millions of dollars that came to your district. So there were an opportunity for lawmakers to work together to pool their allotted amounts to fund bigger regional projects. So in that way and others, they were a boon for, kind of what we call the rarest of Washington commodities, which is bipartisan cooperation, which voters love. Voters love when their members of Congress are bipartisan. So it's just a tough, it's a tough, situation. So this is just kind of a fun anecdote that I read about when I was doing research. But in 2003, reporters asked Congressman John Murtha, who was a Democratic defense appropriator who controlled about $4 billion in earmarks each year, about Congressman Tom DeLay, who was the Republican leader known as the Hammer, because he was really good at lifting votes and making sure that laws were being passed. So Congressman Murtha apparently sat in the far corner of the Democratic side of the House, kind of out of view from the press galleries. And DeLay would sometimes come to him to visit him before a really tight vote. And DeLay would need a few Democrats to secure a win on the floor. And Congressman Murtha basically said that he would come over, Tom DeLay would come over to the corner and kind of work it out with him. And because Murtha had earmarking power, and that meant that he had a roster of people who kind of owed him favors. So for a little bit more money, he could easily swing a small block of voters, very ideological voters, to help DeLay pass a bill. So these two congressmen didn't agree on much. They were kind of on opposite sides of the spectrum, but earmarks kept them talking and kept them working together.
How does Smith's group depend on earmarks and toss-ups?
Sure. So going into my last slide, I wanted to go over how earmarks kind of affects our business. So obviously, the government is one of Smith's biggest customers, especially for Smith's Detection and Smith's Interconnect. And the government provides funding for specific technologies for Smith. So in the past, earmarking was very helpful for our company because we could just work with members of Congress and educate them on our technologies and make sure they were aware of our solutions for any the issues that they might have, and that would kind of be enough to get an earmark. Now obviously earmarks are banned, so we can't do that. So basically we have to work both with members of Congress just to make sure that they're educated on our technologies, and then also government agencies also to make sure that they're educated about our technologies if we want to advocate for one of our technologies to be used in a government program. So we do this by working with industry members to monitor each fiscal year budget to ensure that at least the program that our technologies could potentially go to is well funded. So that doesn't necessarily, again, earmarking is banned, so members can't say, okay, we're going to use a specific amount of money for this agency to buy Smith's Detection's products. They're not allowed to do that. So we just have to make sure that they're educated so that when they do fund a project that our technologies could be used for, that they're aware that they're available and that they're great, that they're great products that can really help their solutions. So Kevin Schmidt in our office works primarily with Smith's Detection and Smith's Interconnect, and as you can see, even with earmarks being banned, we have still secured government funding for specific programs, specifically for the JCAD, the Joint Chemical Defense Program, which is Smith's Detection provides a technology. By the government, it's called JCAD, that basically allows soldiers to detect seed burning threats, and it's used by the domestic nuclear defense office. So, and we were able to secure $19 million in the FY16 defense appropriations, and then $5 million in research and development for the next generation program, next generation JCAD in those in the FY16 bill. So again, we weren't able to, you can suggest money like how much it could potentially cost, but obviously that would technically be an earmark. So it's really up to the government agency, and then also on the congressional side as to how much a government program is going to get. So it's definitely a much more complicated process. And if Kevin were here today, he could definitely tell you a lot more about that in detail. But it is now you have to work both sides. You have to work with the members and with the government agency to make sure everyone is educated, and then do everything you can to make sure that a program is funded, and then when the budget comes out at the end of the day, after you've done all of your work, just kind of hope for the best and hope that it's been funded appropriately. So for a few examples with Smith's Interconnect is kind of different because we mostly interact with our customers, such as Raytheon, to ensure their programs of interest are well funded. And that includes, recently we worked with Raytheon on the Patriot Mods satellite, because I believe Smith's Interconnect provides a sensor for that satellite, and that program got a $10 million increase from the government. So that's just kind of an example of how we have to now work now that earmarks are banned. And again, it's kind of it's just another example as to why earmarks again would be helpful, because obviously Smith provides great technologies that can really help the government, and it's just a little bit tougher for the government to figure out which technologies can, can be used, and we have to work really hard to make sure they're educated. So that's the end of the presentation. Again, my sincerest apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning. Does anyone have any questions? No questions? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And again, if you couldn't hear me at the beginning, and I'm sorry about that, this is being recorded, and it will be up on our portal later today at usgr.smiths.com.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah.